Good evening and welcome to UK Crime Book Club. This evening, I'm delighted to be joined by author Tom Mead, who is here to be chatting about his third book in the Joseph Spector series. Hi, Tom. Really good to see you again. Thank you for joining us.
Karen. Yes, hi, Karen. Thank you so much for having me back. It's becoming a bit of a tradition now. This is our third chat in publication week of my third book, so it's it's a lovely tradition to get into.
No, it's great. It's been brilliant to sort of follow your journey, and now we're on, as we say, book 3. And we were just saying before that neither of us have a real copy, but you do have a lovely cover of the book.
Yes, that's right. I've given away my last author copy, and I'm between batches, but that is the cover. It's a very fabulous piece of artwork
It is gorgeous,
for the UK
really
edition. Yes, and published by Head of Zeus, and comes out this Thursday, August the 1st.
Brilliant. Yeah, because I when I was doing my sort of research and things, I was looking back. So you have had one a year, haven't you? And actually it's probably slightly more, wasn't it? Because the first and second came out quite closely together.
They did, you're right. I think the idea or the ideal going forward would be one a year. But last year I had 2 out in the UK. Death and the Conjurer, the first, that was in February of 2023, and then The Murder Wheel, the second one, came out in October of 2023. But that is, I mean, there are various reasons for it, but really it's because the books actually come out in the US before they come out in the UK.
I saw that, yeah.
Yes. Death and the Conjurer actually came out in the US in summer of 2022. So there were a few months in between the US and UK publication. So now it's a case of the UK publisher sort of falling into step with the US,
right,
and more or less syncing things up date wise. But yeah, it did mean that last year was particularly busy. This year has also been very busy so far, which is obviously a good thing. But I've been able to concentrate more specifically on promoting book 3 and on writing book 4.
Yeah, so we'll come back to that in a second. So for we've got some, I'm just looking at the chat as well, because so we've got Laura and Sarah both watching, who they're enjoying, after both of them have enjoyed book 1 and 2, and Sarah's enjoyed book 3. She read it early on NetGalley.
So lovely. Yes. Oh, terrific. Thanks so much, Sarah and Laura.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah. And so Laura's reading book 3 at the moment on Pigeonhole, which is really good, isn't it? That's where you get the sort of staves, isn't it? Every day or every week. I can't remember.
That's it. Yes. I wasn't too familiar, to be honest, until Cabaret Macabre was involved. But yeah, it's a fabulous thing.
Yeah. So for people who are watching who aren't familiar with your books, would you like to introduce you and the books?
Yeah, of course, absolutely. Well, I write vintage style locked room murder mysteries. So they are, I suppose, they're puzzle mysteries. They're about the unraveling the solution to a complex mystery, particularly complex in these cases because they involve so-called impossible crimes. So these are crimes where it seems that there's no physical way that the assailant could have committed the crime. So in that respect, I suppose those kinds of puzzles are they may be likened to magic tricks. That's been my approach from the beginning, because I think that the principles underlying magic and the locked room puzzle mystery subgenre are basically the same. In both instances, it's about the performer. So in my case, it's me, the author, who is essentially putting together a string of illusions in the form of a novel, and I suppose deliberately controlling the attention and perceptions of an audience. So it's about, you know, making sure that the reader doesn't spot how the tricks are worked, but then at the same time making sure that all the clues are there, so that you get that satisfying little kick at the end when you realize that you know, it was the solution was always there in plain sight. So so that's my approach. The books are heavily inspired by golden age detective fiction. So I grew up reading Agatha Christie, as many did. She was one of my introductions to not just mystery fiction, but to the world of reading and books, you know. And she was incredibly skillful as a plotter. She made it look very easy to pull off these brilliant literary sleights of hand. So I suppose even from a very young age, I was in awe of her skill, really. And of course, her work led me to discover other great Golden Age authors. And a personal favourite of mine is John Dickson Carr, whom I always mention just because he was so great at writing locked room mysteries in particular. He had a wonderful style as a prose writer, but as a plotter, he was pretty much top of the range. You know, I'd rank him up there with Agatha Christie. But there are so many other authors that I discovered and loved. Some of them are more well known than others. People like Christiana Brand, Nicholas Blake, Helen McCloy, Ellery Queen. These are authors who've drifted in and out of print over the years, but these days they seem to be enjoying a bit of a renaissance, a kind of critical renaissance. There are some authors who have never lost their popularity. People like Edmund Crispin, who also wrote some brilliant locked room mysteries and had a fabulous style and wit, but also a very meticulous and ingenious style of plotting. So it's these kinds of authors that interest me, and I'm always drawn to the theatrical, the slightly over the top, deliberately heightened and surreal and a bit weird. So my detective character is a stage magician, a retired stage magician called Joseph Spector, because that allows me to, you know, to indulge my particular fascination with theatre and with magic and all things theatrical, really. The first two books are set in and around Theatreland, London's West End, in the 1930s. So it's an excuse for me to really delve into that particular milieu and really, you know, really go for it and reflect the sort of baroque nature of the setting and characters in the stylized nature of the plot. But obviously, Cabaret Macabre is a bit different. It's not set in the West End. It's a country house mystery. So again, it's a very familiar Golden Age setup, but it differs from the first two because obviously we've got this rural, isolated setting, this snowbound country house with this this family secluded at this ill-fated Christmas party, and I suppose this enabled me to play up the more gothic aspects of the classic mystery plot to you know, have some fun with the more gruesome, bloodthirsty side of things, and also to kind of amp up the atmosphere and approach it almost like a haunted house tale, if you like, where I'm building up the setting as a key component, not only of the plot of the atmosphere, but of the plot. It has a very important part to play in the story and the way it unfolds. Yes, but it's still a very theatrical piece of work, I think. Yeah, I've talked previously about how it's essentially a retelling of the Revengers tragedy, which is a Jacobean drama that has always intrigued me. It's rather like a John Webster type of play, very gruesome. There are copious murders and deceptions and disguises and impostures. And I thought it would be fun to take the plot of the Revengers tragedy and kind of turn it inside out and turn it into a murder mystery, and try to imbue it with a sense of mystery, because obviously the play is not a mystery. The identity of the Revenger is known from the very beginning, but this time in Cabaret Macabre, I thought if I can kind of subvert the plot of the Revengers tragedy, it'll at the same time celebrate the work and pay homage to it, but take it in a different direction.
Because we're talking about the sort of country house, and I think the country house is always like for me, like that's the sort of iconic sort of Agatha Christie sort of, you know, sort of dysfunctional family country house. So I was interested in two aspects of that, but then the other part of the setting is that you've got a sanatorium involved, which also is sort of, I was really interested in how those sort of two came about and how they came together, and what sort of inspired you to use Marchbanks rather than the sort of previous settings that you've had in the theatre.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And yes, you're right. There are, I suppose, two main settings in Cabaret Macabre. The first is Marchbanks, the country house that I've talked about, which is the country seat of a high society family, the Drurys, who find themselves being picked off one by one in various bizarre fashions by a very tricksy killer who's very hard to pin down. But then the other setting is, as you say, it's a private sanatorium or an asylum, as it would have been referred to. And now these were this particular setting is again, I suppose it plays into the Gothic, but it is, while it's not directly based on a real institution or anything like that, it's inspired by my reading and research around the way that issues of mental health were, I suppose, studied and treated at the time. And you would have you would occasionally have these wealthy doctors who would essentially run their own private secluded institutions where they would practice on patients, and it is a very I suppose a very disturbing topic, because they were essentially unregulated, and there was no real way of knowing what went on, what sort of bizarre experimental procedures and treatments were going on at these places. But at the same time, I suppose psychology and psychiatry have always interested me. The first book, Death and the Conjurer, the first murder victim is a psychiatrist who is loosely based on Sigmund Freud. And so there's a kind of running theme through all the books of, I suppose, the interactions between our inner worlds, the worlds of our minds, and the world around us. Because to me, that's the essence of the mystery. Really, it's all about our perceptions of the world around us and how they can be manipulated and controlled by other people. And I suppose that the asylum in Cabaret Macabre is a microcosm of that, because you have this doctor who is essentially controlling this handful of patients in this secluded environment. But as things go on, we start to wonder, who's really in control. And to me, that was an interesting stimulus that got the ideas flowing. And I thought it would also be an effective kind of mirror image of Marchbanks, if you like, this kind of perverse, uncanny, dark side of Marchbanks. So they are the two main settings of Cabaret Macabre. Any viewers can probably tell that it's a very I suppose I like to play up the Gothic tradition in detective fiction, because the locked room mystery goes all the way back to Edgar Allan Poe, and I think there's a rich strain of the Gothic throughout the Golden Age in my particular favorites. So I'm trying to tap into that in Cabaret Macabre.
I like the I mean, I was sort of thinking really way back to sort of Gothic. I'm thinking of like Dracula and having the that's got the asylum in it with Renfield, and that immediately sort of came to my head when I was reading it. And I think obviously they weren't, whether it was a public asylum or whether it was a private one, people were in them weren't treated well. So that also adds to the horror a bit, doesn't it?
It does, and it is a very fascinating subject. I think just the evolution of those kinds of practices, but the idea of I suppose, to use a word, madness, or losing control of yourself, of your understanding of the world, and things like that. It's a real kind of deep-seated, I suppose, a kind of evolutionary horror that we all have. It's kind of a primitive, very primitive. It taps into our sort of primitive base instincts. We like to we need to know, we need to understand the world around us, and I think a mystery, and a puzzle mystery in particular, which seems to flout the rules of logic, it's an effective analogy, really, for that those particular processes that we have going on in our minds.
Because in this one, you mentioned earlier about, you've got Sir Giles, he's a judge, and he's got his family. We've got Ambrose, sort of the youngest son, who's done every sort of occupation, hasn't he? He's a bit of an arty type, and he's been an actor.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, he hasn't been an actor yet. He's been a novelist and a painter, and now he's going to try his hand at the sort of theatre as well. And then there's Leonard, who's the eldest, I'll say, and then there's Sylvester, who is the other eldest. So, and then there's the wife who so quite early on in the book, and I don't think this is a major spoiler, but that she visits Joseph Spector, doesn't she, to sort of to voice her concerns about what she thinks is happening around.
It's rather a complex family setup. each of those characters has a counterpart in the Revenger's tragedy. So my inspiration that I took from that play is particularly noticeable in the in the family tree and in the dramatic personae. But yes, we have the judge, the hanging judge, a bit of a notoriously cruel, heartless type of figure, as these judges often are in Golden Age crime fiction. It's a very, I suppose, recognizable character type. I mean, I think of the judge in Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None, for instance. There's a judge in John Dixon Carr's The Seat of the Scornful. Who's a very prominent, who's a very prominent character, and so this particular type of character is very recognizable. But I thought it would be interesting to make him the focus of what appears to be a murderous conspiracy. He's having these threats against his life, but of course, we don't really know who is responsible for this chain of poison pen letters and threats that he's been receiving. And so Spectre is recruited by the judge's wife as an inquiry agent, a kind of a private investigator, if you like, because of course we're set in the 30s, even the latter end of the 30s. There's this I suppose this fear of scandal, this deep-seated fear of scandal in the among the upper classes, etc. So that's why Spectre is recruited by the Drurys. But there's this lingering suspicion that one or other of the judge's 3 sons might be, or rather, well, it might be involved in some way. I don't want to say too much, but inevitably things escalate from there, and we start to see a very strange series of murders taking place. And the prime suspect is a man called Victor Silvius, and he has the catch, I suppose, is that he has been an inmate of this private asylum for 9 years, and therefore he's essentially been locked in a padded room for the entirety of those 9 years, and yet it appears that he's also responsible for this strange campaign of violence that's going on against the Drury family. So there's your basic premise behind it, and I've introduced some of the characters. We've got his various wastrel sons, who I've tried to make the 3 of them very distinct, and give them their own personalities. So you mentioned Ambrose. He's I suppose he's the artistic one, you might say. He's the one who dabbles in communism and all these kinds of things that were very fashionable among the bright young things of the 20s and 30s. And then you've got Leonard. He's the well, he is a working actor, but he's a bit of a B-list actor who's not actually as good as he thinks he is, and he's already getting a bit over the hill, you know, and I think he's very jealous of his younger brother Ambrose, who seems to be on the rise. So and then of course we've got Sylvester, who I won't say too much about him, but he's also got a part to play.
Yeah.
So really, it's about exploring these the dynamics within that family as a kind of a lens through which to view the mystery, and to try and pick apart the strange relationships between these people, to understand what's really going on under the surface.
Because family relationships are always interesting, aren't they? Because there's so much that you don't see under the surface and things. So, and particularly with sort of like the upper class families that, you know, they kept, like you said, there's that whole thing about a scandal. So if there was anything going on, they were definitely going to keep that hidden from everybody else at all costs.
Yeah. There are so many real life instances from this particular period, but I mean, even going through the 20th century and even into the 21st century of this, I suppose, this kind of outmoded notion of a sense of decorum at all costs, and this idea of closing ranks if anything untoward should occur, and that kind of thing, which is obviously very fertile ground for murder mystery plotting, because everybody's got their secrets. Yes, I think it allows us to really explore the psychology of characters, but also the psychology of the reader, which is what really interests me, to kind of play, I suppose, mental games with the reader, and give them a challenge to see if they can see through all of the deceptions that are going on between all these people.
Yeah, you always normally get me. I can never guess them. Get the end, and I'm like, oh, I don't know how he did that again. Did you so you, I mean, this book has got a lot of characters, isn't it? And so is that a challenge when you're writing, you know, when you've and got sort of the two threads of the story as well? Is that sort of difficult to sort of to write? Did you write them separately, or did you write them as one?
No, I wrote them as one, but because I think they were you know, the different strands of the story all feed into one another. So I think if I had tried to compartmentalize them, it would have been a bit jarring, perhaps, and it would have made it more difficult to thread the clues throughout, for instance. But in terms of juggling a lot of characters, I think when you're writing characters, if they're sort of bit players, if they don't have a major role in the plot, at the same time, if you want to make them credible, believable in a short space of time, it's just a question of considering what each character wants. Now, this is something that creative writing teachers talk about a lot, but it really is true. Every character wants something, and if you can get a handle on that, then their role in each scene becomes clearer, and so that's how I approach writing a large cast of characters. It's just a question of juggling individual perspectives and individual wants. But Agatha Christie, who I already talked about, but she was really brilliant at making you feel that you knew a character within a comparatively short space of time, or a very brief few paragraphs or even sentences. Now that's it's something that I don't think she often gets credit for, really, but she had a great insight into what makes people tick, and I think that particularly comes across in the way that she introduces characters, and you can meet a side character, a character who's not going to have a prominent role in the piece, but she is able to convince you that this person has a I
The
suppose
role.
an inner life, has a role to play.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I was trying to kind of channel that sort of approach with writing these characters, but obviously there are a few walk-on roles, if you like,
Yeah.
but at the same time, I think the core of Cabaret Macabre, it comes down to the Drury family, and it comes down to the residents of the aforementioned asylum.
Yeah.
So you're probably dealing with fewer than 10
Yeah.
characters as the main focal point of the novel. So that is where the bulk of my energies went when I was writing. And the other characters, I just had a bit of fun and tried to make them as distinctive and interesting
Yeah.
as possible.
Because talking of characters, so Joseph, we'll come back to Joseph Spector. So Joseph Spector has been in all of your 3 books, along with Detective or Inspector George Flint.
Yes.
So Laura's actually asked why you chose Spector as an investigator and not the standard police sleuth. So yeah, well, I'll ask you that one first, and then I've got a sort of another bit onto that. So
yeah, well, I mean, it's a good question. Spector is deliberately an unorthodox sleuth. In the Golden Age tradition, he is an amateur sleuth who is recruited by a baffled Scotland Yard. So that is, I mean, if you think of characters like Hercule Poirot, Agatha Christie's great detective, or Gideon Fell, who is John Dixon Carr's great detective, or even Sherlock Holmes, who is, I suppose, one of the original archetypes of that type of gentleman sleuth, if you like. Then there's this rich tradition of that particular character type. And I wanted somebody who would have a particular insight into impossible crimes, or in other words, crimes which resemble magic tricks, whether that's by accident or design. So having a retired magician seemed to be the best approach for that. And again, as I mentioned earlier, it's an excuse for me to indulge my own interest in magic as well. So it's the best of both worlds, really. And I wanted somebody who's a bit theatrical, and someone whose presence in a plot is guaranteed to shake things up a little and stir things up, but not necessarily in ways that you would expect. It's also, I think, important to have a more stolid, staid, grounded counterpart. So obviously we've got Flint, who is the conventional Scotland Yard investigator who has this this friendship and this connection with Spector. And to be honest, I've become aware, the more I write, the more I find that Flint is he's the focal point. He's the if you like, he's the kind of everyman character. He's the one who is rather like a Dr. Watson type. He is there to, I suppose, reflect the ingenuity of Spector and to serve as a kind of a reader surrogate within the plot. Spector is more of I mean, his name gives it away, really. He kind of, I suppose, he sort of haunts the plot. He's often drifting at the periphery of things, like in The Murder Wheel, for instance, which is set in the backstage corridors of a fictional West End theatre. We have a bizarre crime that takes place on stage during a magic show, and Spector is in the audience. But Spector, he doesn't. He's rather, I suppose, reticent in the first part of the book. He just observes and he sees what goes on. But of course, by the end, we realize that he's seen so much more than he's letting on. And he, of course, is the one to unravel the bizarre tapestry of mysteries. But so I think the two characters complement each other quite nicely, in that Flint is a character who will do the legwork and who will ask the questions, whereas Spectre is he's the cerebral character, but at the same time he's the one who will who is capable of these kind of grand coups de théâtre, where he will you know, unveil the identity of the killer or the mechanics of the trick in a very colorful fashion. So they're two sides of the same coin, you might say.
I was wondering, that has it got easier to write them, that now that you've got to know them so well? So obviously when you wrote book one, you obviously had an idea of what those characters were going to be, but do you sort of feel like, I guess, that you know them more? And I was thinking about Agatha Christie as well, and how she disliked Poirot come the end, because he became, like, everybody wanted him, didn't they? So
yes.
Not that I think that you're, you know, I don't think, well, I don't know that you, but do you like him more than you did when you started, or less?
Well, the interesting thing is that, well, Spectre hasn't really changed as a character, because he began as a deliberately heightened character with a fascination for all things occult and bizarre, and he's got his house in Putney with his collection of macabre bric-a-brac and weird exhibits and ancient tomes of witchcraft and what have you. But he's always had that. And I've deliberately made a point of revealing very little about his inner life, because I think a bit of mystery regarding those kinds of characters is beneficial. And of course, he is essentially a stage persona, and so you never really know when he's acting, and he likes to play up to that, and to you know, to wrong foot people. Sometimes he'll pretend to be older than he really is, and he'll pretend to be, you know, frail and confused, but then he will suddenly pull off some feat of athletics that you wouldn't think he was capable of, because he's a performer, and he uses that to his advantage. Flint, however, I suppose, has gone through a more conventional character development, as in, I feel that I have come to know more about his likes and dislikes, his personal life, that sort of thing, because to begin with, he was really more of a sort of cipher. He was there to he was there as a necessary functionary within the plot, but he was a comparatively minor character in Death and the Conjurer, the first book. But now I tend to think of him essentially on par with Spectre. I mean, I mentioned that they're essentially two halves of the same thought, if you like.
No, I really like, I've really enjoyed getting to know them. And I think one of the things I was going to say is that although this book is book 3, you can read them as standalone, can't you? There's enough in them to sort of link you back if you don't want to start. So if you want to start book 1, you can. And I have been lucky enough to read all 3. So I've really enjoyed that sort of getting to know them. I think it's, for the reader, it's getting to know them. As an author, you obviously do know them. And I guess you do get to know them more, but you know where you're going with it, don't you? Whereas a reader, you're sort of, and I think he's very quirky, isn't he, Spectre? I like his he does some really odd things at times.
I think in terms of reading them as standalones, I again was looking to the golden age, where you would have authors like John Dixon Carr, like Agatha Christie. You would never feel the need to read all the Agatha Christie, Poirot, or Miss Marple novels in order, for example. They are they are designed and constructed in such a way that each novel acts as its own kind of introduction to the world. And so that's the kind of thing that I was going for with the Spectre books, this idea that inevitably, if you've been there from the beginning and you've read them in order, you will there will be things that you will spot. There will be little details that will stand out to you in a way that they wouldn't for somebody who's coming to the book, to the series fresh at book 3, for instance. But to me, that's more of a little bonus for people who read them in order. I think if you are starting with book 3, you'll get a handle on the series and the characters just as readily as you would if you started at the beginning. But really, it's I suppose if you enjoy book 3, obviously it hopefully you'll be encouraged to go back and read the others.
Go back and read it. Yeah,
yes, but and you won't be put off by the fact that they are set before the events of book 3. You can read them out of order. An author who was particularly good for that sort of thing, who's more contemporary, was the late Christopher Fowler. His Bryant and May mysteries they were delightfully quirky, but very clever and very atmospheric, and a long-running series, but you could jump on board at any point, and you could sort of dot around the series. And so again, I think that's a strength of this particular genre, really. If you're writing a more a police procedural, for instance, which is more grounded, more naturalistic, then it's beneficial to be there from the beginning to get to know characters in a more conventional sense. But when each novel is its own kind of self-contained puzzle with familiar characters at its heart, it's easier to dip in and out or to read out of sequence. So that's my particular philosophy of that sort of thing, and each novel's designed basically to be readable as a standalone.
Because one of the things I was going to ask you is, because the books, as you said, it's very intricate, it's complex, and you have to mesh together the stories and the characters, and then so what is the most difficult part of what has been the most difficult part of getting this story together? Was there any bits where you were like, oh, or were there many?
Yes. I mean, the idea is to set myself a challenge. I don't like the idea of recycling a particular formula. So obviously I want each book and each story to feel distinct from the one that preceded it. So to be honest, in terms of challenges, it was more about pushing myself in terms of what bizarre new murderous contrivance can I come up with, because I wanted them to. Obviously, there's a higher body count in book 3 than there were in the previous 2 books. I mean, not as high as And Then There Were None, for instance, but I suppose that reflects its origins as a retelling of the Jacobean tragedy, which is very has an incredibly high body count. But I suppose in terms of challenges, it was really about making each of the fates of my characters feel distinct from the last, so that it doesn't become repetitive, and to come up with, I suppose, intricate but practical methods for dispatching them. So for instance, we have a body that is found in a rowing boat in the center of a frozen lake, and the question is, how did the murdered body get there without disturbing the ice on the lake? So that is one of the impossible
Yeah.
puzzles, if you like, which Spectre has to solve. So it's not just a question of who done it, but it's how did this particular set of
How
circumstances
done
come
it?
to be,
Yeah.
and why? You know what? You know, if it was orchestrated by the criminal, why? What was the motivation behind it? Then we have a locked room shooting, which we have a murder victim who is killed in a room which appears to have been completely sealed on the inside, and so it appears that the criminal has vanished into thin air. So yeah, I suppose it's about coming up with original spins on the same effect, the effect of an impossible crime. So that is always the challenge, but it's also the most entertaining part for me as a plotter.
Yeah.
So yeah, so there you go. I won't say any more about any of the methods and what have you, because there are
No.
various, and they all sort of interlink and complement one another in strange ways.
So I mean, you've mentioned that you like so you really sort of take the inspiration from the magic and the theatre. So do you still carry out research for the books? You know, for the next one, you know, sort of. So is that something you obviously have a wealth of knowledge already, but do you still find that you want to find out more, sort of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, I'm wary of resting on my laurels and what I
Yeah.
have already done. So I'm always looking for new sources of information and sources of ideas, uh, which I can tie into the Golden Age, I suppose. So, for instance, in book 4, which will be coming out next summer, I have a psychic medium who performs a séance. And now that is a familiar scenario from Golden Age detective fiction, but it's not something that I've used before in any of the Spectre books, and so it set me off on a whole different path of looking
Yeah.
at how fraudulent mediums would use theatrical trickery to convince
Yeah.
their clients of supernatural phenomena. I suppose the research is suggested by the plot, um, rather than the research dictating the plot.
Yeah.
It's about, I'll come up with a basic outline, and then I'll think, what sort of research will I need to pull that off convincingly.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's the way I go about it. And of course, with stage magic, there are so many different permutations of it.
Yeah.
I mean, there's the way that tricks are performed, the actual practical way that tricks are done, but there's also the philosophy of magic and the psychology behind it, and even the neurology of it, which parts of the brain are in play when a person is viewing a magic trick. And so I'm fascinated by all of it, really.
Oh,
I don't claim to be any kind of an expert. It's just something that fascinates me, and I think the unanswered questions that I have are usually a good focal point for research.
so do you so you've said book 4 is coming out next summer. So have you do you sort of are you looking sort of forward to, you know, further than that, book 5, book 6, or are you?
Well, I would, yeah, absolutely. I would love to continue writing about these characters in these strange and wacky murder mystery scenarios. But book 4, I have actually finished my draft last month, so I'm still edits etc. still pending. So I'm not looking any further than that presently. I'm just I'll get book 4 done and dusted, and then I'll move on to the next thing. But yes, book 4, it's there beginning to end, but now comes the nitty gritty of the edits and what have you.
And you obviously, with a book which is actually, Sarah's just said that you blew her mind with the solutions to the impossible crime. So I imagine that's a compliment, and I imagine that sort of thing does take quite a lot of headspace. So you can't be thinking about something else when you're trying to fine tune that.
Yeah, that's it. Because it's an interesting one, because I always like to have more than one puzzle within a mystery novel, but I want each of the puzzles to, I suppose, complement the others, and to I want them to feel like more than the sum of their parts, so that each of the elements of the mystery come together in a kind of satisfying, unified whole. So it's a bit of a tricky balance, because of course it means that I am spinning plates and trying to do various things at once, but at the same time, each of the impossible crimes, for instance, there'll be in some cases a deceptively simple trick, and it's about making sure that it's not obvious, that it's well concealed, but at the same time that it feels fair to the reader, and things like that. So it does take a certain amount of nuance, or at least that's the idea. That's the way that I approach it. I try to make it feel as finessed as possible, so that there's no information just falling out of the sky from nowhere. You want everything to feel that it has its place there, and that when your attention is drawn to it, you want to be thinking, of course, it was there all along, you know. So yeah, I suppose I do get a bit of tunnel vision when I'm delving into the particular mechanics of a mystery, and so I try not to think too far ahead of myself.
Yeah, because when I was thinking about sort of at the moment, you're obviously, you've got this one coming out, so obviously there's going to be sort of promotionals and events and things like that. So have you got events coming up?
Yes,
in person?
Yes, I've got a whole bunch of events, actually. I've been doing, well, I've got into the habit of doing in conversation type events, where it'll be me and another author.
Yeah.
Because I think that they are very they're great. I did a fabulous one with Natalie Marlowe. I don't know if you've spoken to Natalie on.
I think so. Somebody else may have, but I haven't. Yeah.
Natalie's great. But we did a talk at the Heath Bookshop in Birmingham, and it was fabulous. It was just so nice to talk to somebody else who is in the same business, and it felt very relaxed and conversational. And the audience asked some great questions, and that sort of thing. So I've been trying to do more of those. My next one is actually, well, I have a launch for Cabaret Macabre, which is at my local library in Derby, where a lot of the book was written. So that is open to the public. You can find the details on my website and on my social media. That is on the 8th of August. But then in terms of In Conversations, I have one coming up with Kate Ellis, who is a fabulous author. And a real favourite of mine. I was so pleased to meet her in Wales for the Alibis in the Archive conference. So I couldn't resist asking her if she'd be interested in doing an In Conversation. So that will be great. The details have yet to be announced, but that will be towards the end of August, and it will be It will be in the Greater Manchester area. And then, yes, I have a bunch of others. Some have been announced, some have not. But all the details will be available on my social media. So if you give me a follow on your preferred social media, or take a look at my website, tommeadauthor.com, and it's all there.
Brilliant. Sounds like you're going to be busy as well as editing book 4.
That's right. Yes. I mean, the thing is, I was working pretty solidly on book 4 from January to June, and so it's quite nice now to make the time to talk to readers, to talk to writers, and to to get out there into the real world.
Bit more sociable, because imagine it is quite isolating at times when you're and other authors have said it as well, as when you're in that sort of space, and you need that headspace, don't you, to be able to go into it.
I mean, I do certainly, but somewhat perversely, I tend to write out and about. So I will write in the library, as I mentioned, but I do a lot of writing in cafes and things like that. So I sort of need a bit of background noise, almost to help me cultivate the right headspace for the plotting. But at the same time, I do. You inevitably get very involved with what you're doing, and so you almost come blinking out into the sunlight when it's finished.
Just before we go, because I'm just looking at the time, what have you read anything recently that you'd recommend to people watching?
Yes, definitely. The other day I finished a Kate Ellis book, which is it's called Seeking the Dead, and it's the first novel in her series featuring the character Joe Plantagenet, who is a detective in a fictionalized version of York. They're very gruesome, macabre mysteries with elements of the supernatural, or so it appears. Yes, it was my first encounter with this particular series. Her main series is the Wesley Peterson novels, which are brilliant and very long running. There are only a handful of Joe Plantagenet novels, because she started the series comparatively recently, but I'm looking forward to reading more of those. And I've just today finished reading Joyce Carol Oates's 48 Clues in the Disappearance of My Sister, which is not quite her latest. I think it's the one before her latest, but it's published by Head of Zeus. And I always love Joyce Carol Oates. She's a real she has an incredible command of language and a wonderful knack for a kind of claustrophobic suspense, where that things are going to go very badly wrong. It's a very compulsive reading in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, both. I mean, when I worked in the library, both of those names, are both sort of iconic, really. Kate Ellis and Joyce Carol Oates. They're just names that immediately I remember from shelving books.
Both wonderful authors, and both incredibly prolific, which is what I admire. One of the many things I admire about them, and it's something that I aspire to as well. This is why I try and write as much as I can. Because so many. I mean, Agatha Christie and John Dixon Carr, very prolific, but they were able to sustain a level of quality in their work, and they were incredible, great role models in that sense. So I aspire to emulate them.
Well, 3 in just over 2 years isn't too bad. I think you're going in the right direction.
It's whether I have the stamina to keep it going.
Oh, thanks so much for coming on, Tom. It's always a pleasure to speak to you. And I'm, as I said at the beginning, I haven't quite finished this one, so I am going to finish it. I know Sarah and Laura, who've been chatting along as well, have both really enjoyed it. Sarah saying thank you for the hour. So thank you to everybody for joining us. Thank you, Tom. Really good luck with Cabaret Macabre on Thursday when it comes out.
Yes, thank you.
Stunning cover and stunning story as always. So
there it is. And yes, hopefully I'll talk to you again for book 4, Karen.
Yes, I'll look forward to it for next summer.
Yes,
yeah.
Indeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks
Thanks
everybody.
everybody.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Bye.